Welcome to the Woodward Chronicles. This series is dedicated to honoring the legacy of Mr. Ronald Woodward, who served as Wabash County Historian from 1981 to 2025 and was awarded the title of Wabash County Historian Emeritus by the Indiana Historical Society. Mr. Woodward shares Wabash County's recorded history in his own words. Each episode invites us to listen, learn, and reflect on the rich stories from the past. Settle in, we're glad you're here.
But before we begin, since we last talked, I've been doing a little experiment, and in that experiment, I've had some successful results, and I kind of wanted to share those with you today. This is a little vial of, well, you tell me.
Limestone? Gold?
Yes, ma'am.
Gold?
Yes, ma'am. Gold in Wabash County, if you can believe that. This is not quite an ounce, maybe a little over half an ounce, which means it's worth about $1,000. And I found this in Treaty Creek.
You're kidding me.
No, not Treaty Creek, I'm sorry. I found it in Charley Creek. I just live a block from Charley Creek. So I went down, and when I was teaching school, I used to teach a lot about the gold rush. And in fact, we even had a gold rush in the school. I hid money around the entryway and introduced the subject, and then took the kids down, and they could keep whatever they found. And there was about maybe $5 or $10 worth of coins down there. But that's what I have found in just 7 days of panning, an hour a day, going down to Charley Creek and going through the gravel, sifting out the gravel, and then panning. And I have found those flakes of gold. Now, they're nothing large or substantial, but when you put it all together, it begins to add up. And I find about, anywhere between 10 and 20 grains a day, if not more, just by spending an hour playing around. I've always wanted to try and do it here and see what I could find. Historically speaking, in 1868, a gentleman over near LeGros found a 10-ounce nugget. Now, back then, gold was $35 an ounce, so we're talking about $350, which was what a person generally made in a year. He found that 10-ounce nugget. Today, it would be worth about $30,000. And he found one, and for the next 2-3 weeks, local farmers, people in the area just swarmed down along Rush Creek and the Salamone and panned to try and find gold. And of course, they didn't find anything else. The reason there's gold in Wabash County, and it's not very much, it's what we call gold flour, very small flakes, but it came down with the glaciers 13,000 years ago. When the last glacier came here, it brought down all kinds of rock. Normally you find limestone. That's what we're known for. But occasionally, if you're walking out in the reservoir or along creek bank, you'll find other kind of rocks that were brought down with the glacier as well. The most famous rock in Wabash County brought down by the glacier is the Moon Rock, which is west of town on Old 24, over by the LensCrafter factory. Right beside it, hidden in a grove of trees, is a huge pudding stone that would be about the size of the length of this room, width of this room, and maybe as tall as 7 feet. It was carried down by the glaciers. The Indians worshiped that. Anytime they went by, they would leave offerings there of tobacco or what have you. Early settlers found it truly amazing to see a rock like that. We call it an erratic. That's its technical name, an erratic, carried down by those glaciers and left here. But it reminds us of our past and our Indian heritage, because the Native American sort of worshiped that stone, calling it the moon rock. In one legend, they thought that the gods had had a battle at one time and they threw those rocks at one another. But have you, whatever you want to believe on that, it's an interesting place in our county and has a tremendous history, yet it's not very well known. People don't visit it very often, and people are discouraged from visiting there because they've been known to do some rather unusual things at that rock. So being hidden may have protected it and saved it for a while. So rocks have been important in our county, and other things can be found in the reservoir as well. I have found jasper, samples of jasper. I've found nickel, iron fragments. Oh, I even have a ruby that I found. It's not a very big ruby, but it's maybe a half an inch. But if you look closely, you can find all kinds of unique rocks, especially when the reservoir lets out the water and it's empty. I don't think they particularly like these days for people to go down and explore, but if you walk, you may kick up an unusual stone or two that might be of interest to you. So it's worthwhile to walk down and walk through the reservoirs when the water's down, not only just to see the remnants of Dora and New Holland and in the Mississinawa to see the old Somerset location or the Red Bridge location, but just to walk down and see what's there. You never know what you're going to find. And if you ever spot black sand that looks black, that's a pretty good indication that if you were to pan there, you just might find a few fragments of gold like the ones I showed you. You never know. But I'll put it this way. There's more than corn in Indiana and more than corn in Wabash County.
Just because we're on this gold rush, this is a great, even this wasn't our original idea to talk about today, which is what I love about spending any time with you, is the fact that we never know where this conversation might find us too. But back to the gold rush, you said that that vial you have found was about how much?
Oh, I would estimate this is about half an ounce, which would be roughly about $1,000.
Wow. And so going back to the gold rush, you said the mid 1800s, 1865-ish?
1868.
1868. What was it like here? When you think about the settlements that would have been here in around 1868, what would the size of Wabash been at that time? And was it an actual rush like is portrayed on like the History Channel on television?
Well, in the 1860s, I think the population of Wabash County would have been roughly about 16,000 people. The major city would have been Wabash, but there would have been a lot of competition with LeGros. LeGros was still rather prominent as a community. It had a tremendous number of warehouses and a lot of business along the Wabash and Erie Canal. So it was very prominent as well. Of course, there was North Manchester, not as big as LeGros, but it was starting to grow. Then there was Liberty Mills, Laketon, Somerset, Rowan. Those would have all been the larger communities. LeGros would have had close to, I'm going to say roughly about 1,200 people. Wabash would have had close to 1,600 people. Both would have been right on the canal and prominent ports on the canal, Wabash and Erie Canal, and had been since the 1830s. The train had come through in the 1850s, making its way through both towns, which helped to keep them both prominent towns and important economic centers for the county. In Wabash, there would have been approximately 4 hotels. In LeGros, it would have had about 3. Of course, there would have been hotels in all the other communities as well. at least one in all of them. And agricultural, but was beginning to become industrial. LeGros would have had a furniture factory, buggy works, blacksmiths, grocery stores, probably about 4 grocery stores, maybe 4 or 5 bars. Sometimes the grocery store was also a bar or tavern. There would have been a train station, grain warehouse. There were at least 4 or 5 grain elevators or warehouses along Washington Street, East Washington Street. There would have been 2 grist mills, and everything else you might want or need was available there, agricultural implements and so forth. Wabash would have been a little bit bigger. Canal Street would have been lined with warehouses that were 3 stories tall, mainly along West Canal Street from the landing at Wabash Street on down past the landing to Cass Street. And at the corner of Cass Street would have been a grist mill. So both communities were very large and very, for the time, and a lot was going on, a lot of social life and active. It was not unusual for wagons coming up the America Road and crossing the bridge at LeGros to have as many as 6 or 10 wagons backed up waiting to unload in those warehouses or to unload onto one of the canal boats that were going by. And of course, the hotels were always busy with canal travelers. Hotels were not as expensive as we might think. Generally, it cost about $1 a night, and that included your meal. Unfortunately, sometimes you had to share a room with other people. If they were extremely crowded, you might have 4 or 5 people in the same room or in the same bed or sleeping on the floor. And of course, hygiene wasn't like it is today, so you might walk away with a lot of fleas and bug bites and unwanted guests that you didn't want. But for $1, you could spend the night and you could have a good meal as well. And sometimes that would include a barn where you could keep your horse and they would feed it as well. And of course, some hotels were better than other. In LeGros, the Western House was the prime hotel, and people would stay there. It could hold about 50 to 100 people, had a restaurant as well, and just every amenity you might want. No electricity until later, but you'd have a bowl of water in your room, a place to clean up, and then a good meal in a restaurant downstairs. And they were social places. People who lived in the community would also go eat their meals there, and then they would talk with each other. All kinds of people were using the canal. There were vaudeville acts, circuses, all kinds of groups of people would stay overnight in those hotels. And of course, they could get kind of rowdy, and they carried with them the news of other communities, and it was a lively time for those communities in those hotels, those early hotels.
I would have assumed that for some reason in my mind, the gold rush era in Wabash County would have felt more primitive. It doesn't sound like when you're describing what the times were like during around 1868 in Wabash County, it doesn't sound primitive at all.
No. By that time, we were out of our primitive state and had become more settled. We had social organizations, churches. We even had law enforcement by that time. The gold rush in California, of course, gets played up quite a bit, and that was much earlier in 1849. There were about 115 people who left Wabash County to go to the gold fields and try, well, what they said is they called it, we're going to go see the elephant. Elephants were an unusual creature to see when zoos came, not zoos, but circuses came to town. But that was their expression. We're going to go see the elephant, see if we can make some money. Of those 115, I would say 3/4 stayed in California and Oregon or elsewhere. The others came back. Generally, they didn't make very much, and I really feel sorry for one man. One man came back and he had a pouch filled with about $300 worth of gold dust that he had accumulated from the hard work that he had done out there. And he fell asleep on the train. He was coming from Huntington to Wabash and fell asleep on the train, and someone picked his pocket and took his poke full of gold, and he ended up with absolutely nothing. But $300 to us doesn't sound like much, but back then, an average man made between $300 and $500 a year. So it was a considerable amount of money with a lot of purchasing power. But by 1868, our gold rush was just a small affair. Like I said, a man found a 10-ounce nugget, and the word got around, and boy, everybody from the county and even Huntington and Marion and Peru, they came up and tried their hand at it, but they weren't successful. So it only lasted 2 or 3 weeks. I think a few more nuggets might have been found, but they were much smaller in size. So it wasn't anything big, but it was one of those interesting episodes in Wabash County history that we really don't think about. And they went out, they panned, they found a little bit, found that it wasn't worthwhile, went back home and started farming again.
So agriculture would have been a much more viable option than striking it rich, panning for gold, like in the Wabash River, or where were they?
They were panning in the Salamone and in Rush Creek in particular. Rush Creek is near Dora, and they found considerable there. But again, it was just from the glaciers coming down, it was just traces that were left and found within the soil around here and occasionally wash out. I've only been able to find the flakes of gold that I showed you in Charley Creek below the bridge. There's some sandbars above it, and I want to trace those and see if there's any above it. The gold had to have come down from soil washed out. And this segment that I showed you, it just has what we call flour gold, which are just flakes, but larger pieces I've found that have gold on them indicate that they were in other kinds of rock as well. So they had to break off in moving down the creek. Charley Creek can get rather violent when it floods. But one interesting story, there used to be a sandbar behind the Honeywell house. And back in the 20s, a group of boys were playing in the creek, much like they still do today. And they were kicking up sand, and they kicked up a box. It was kind of like a large cigarette box. Kind of deep, so it must have been maybe cigars. It was wrapped up with a cord around it, and they unwrapped it and opened it up, and inside was the skeleton of an infant. A baby had been, someone had a baby, it must have died, and they put it in the box and then buried it in the sandbar, and these boys uncovered it and found it.
When did they uncover it? Do you remember about when?
About the 1920s. Yeah.
So how old would you think the remains were?
I have no idea. It was a story that appeared in the Plain Dealer. And of course, at this time of year in October, we like to tell those kind of stories. They turned it over to the authorities, of course. but it just goes to illustrate you really don't know what you're going to find in a sandbar. My great-granddaughter and I were walking through Charley Creek, and she was picking up rocks and throwing them. And she picked up a rock and started to throw it. And I said, stop just a minute. Let me look at it. She had found a projectile point of an early, it was roughly 1,500 years old. She found a projectile point or a knife blade that was just laying there on the surface that had washed down from above. Every once in a while, when I'm walking through, I'll find the little arms of dolls, the little China dolls. I'll find an arm or such of one of these little China dolls, and well, got a collection of them at home now.
I kind of want to see your collection of China doll arms.
But you never know what you're going to find, and the gold was just, that's an interesting just tidbit of our history.
I don't think that I would have ever thought that we would have found gold here until you tied it back to the glacier retractions and the way that they pulled minerals down. Well, of course, then that does make sense, because I never would have thought you would have found gold here. And you found it recently. I mean, within your lifetime, you have found almost $1,000 worth of gold flake here in the Charley Creek.
Yeah.
You know, after this episode airs, we'll probably see a bunch of people out there panning in the Charley Creek, which when you share these stories and when you're with your granddaughter, the other thing is paying attention and looking around you and where you are exploring it. If we don't do that, we miss things.
Right.
We miss our history, miss what came before us and how we got to be where we are. And just your granddaughter picking up and looking for the rocks. You, unbeknownst, find, little doll, you say porcelain doll, baby arms. I mean, from a time gone by. So it's interesting that we should pay more attention to our creek beds, our sandbars, because they are telling us something.
Yeah, you never know. You really don't know. Wabash County is full of surprises, and people aren't really aware of it. Brown County, they make a big deal out of finding gold down there. Now, I will say, if any of your viewers ever want to go down to Charley Creek and look, that's fine, but I would always ask permission from Adam at the Parks Department.
Yeah.
I'm not the only one. When I asked him permission to do it, he said I was one of 4 people who had to ask him. So there are other people, not just this weird guy talking to you right now, getting some weird idea. There are other people who come up with it. And of course, the state of Indiana does have laws that are in effect as to whether you can do it or not. You go to Brown County, you have to have a license. And there are people who will rent you a pan and tell you where to go and sell you a license. We don't have to have a license. Adam says you're welcome. However, it's nice to just let them know. But you also have to be careful, because Charley Creek does have other things in it besides fossils, besides gold. People throw glass in there, so there's pieces of glass. There's other things that might be floating around in there that you might not want to be associated with.
Just because it could be harmful. It's what doesn't belong there.
Right.
I thought you were going to say like Loch Ness Monster or something was in there.
Well, in panning, I found a worm that was at least 6 inches long that was living in the sandbar, sand fleas, which you don't want to get or have visit you, and other little critters. Who knows what you might come up with? I have seen 7-8 foot long snakes in Charley Creek myself, just walking by. I've also seen other wildlife as well: deer, possum, raccoon. I have found shells in there, so there's mussels that live in the sandbars or around them, and you just never know what you're going to see down there or run into. Heron, I've found a lot of heron down there early in the morning. Heron like to go in and fish, and they'll be standing there on one leg or 2 legs waiting for the minnows to float by. You just never know. I've seen alligator turtles in there, at least a 10-pounder. couple of years ago. A couple of years ago, I had a woman call me up. She had been down to Charley Creek at the falls, and she found an animal frozen in the ice, and she thought it was a monkey. Well, at one time, there was a legend that a circus had visited Wabash and had a monkey by the name of Jocko had gotten loose, and they couldn't catch him. So the circus left town and left the monkey here, and supposedly he lived in Falls Cemetery, and a lot of people swear that ever so often they've seen monkeys swinging from the trees in there. Okay. And other people have claimed that. Well, she swore it was a monkey's body. I said, well, we'll go down and we'll take a look at it. And we chipped it out, and it was a possum. Had a long tail like you'd see a spider monkey, and it did look like a spider monkey, but it was a possum, and it had just been flattened and changed by the ice and moving through the ice down into the falls area. But you never really know. And one day I was going down to Charley Creek, and it was kind of late in the evening, and I had just gotten to Thorn and Stitt Street and Ferry, where they all come together, and standing in the middle of the road was a rat. Now, that rat was as big as your dog. He must have been, I'm going to say 2 feet, 3 feet tall. And he was just standing there, and this guy got out of his car, stopped his car, got out, and took a club, it was a broom handle, and he was swinging at it, and the rat just stood there and looked at him like he was stupid or something. Finally, one blow, he broke the handle in half. The rat just looked at him and stayed there. The man got back in his car and took off. The rat went on down into the creek. Now, that leads to another story. Some big university, I want to say it was the University of Tennessee, came up to Wabash one year, and they were studying the rats of Wabash. And old-timers, they'll tell you, down around off of Mill Street, where the old dump used to be, and Canal Street, that area, the old dump, there used to be rats down there that were quite large, and people would talk about them. And I believe it was the University of Tennessee came up and did a study of the Wabash rats in the late 1960s or early 1970s. I don't know what their conclusion was or what, but they came up to study our rats. So you just don't know what you're going to see down there, what you're going to find. And those are the tamer things that go on down there. But yeah, interesting.
It is interesting because we take for granted the present day that we live in, the right now, what we can see on the surface level, and that curiosity. When you share these stories, it makes me feel even more curious about the places that even still exist today. They might look a little bit different, but the fact that people came and studied rats here, you don't think about that happening because you're thinking about just what the present day looks like. But there is so much that's interesting here. Charley Creek, the falls, and just even the area through the park there under the rail viaduct is beautiful. And I know that I will look at it different. Maybe I'll look for a little gold down there every once. But I will look at it differently now because you just don't think about it. When I think of Gold Rush, I think California, West Coast.
Right.
Madness, danger, violence, greed.
What we forget is that Wabash was like that in the 1820s and 30s. In fact, one of the largest and well-known gangs in all of Indiana, particularly in northeastern Indiana, was the Witt Gang. And the Witt Gang had their headquarters on Pony Creek just to the east of the little town of Servia. And they were known for every violent act you can imagine in northeastern Indiana from the late 1820s into the 1830s. They were counterfeiters. They stole horses. They were what we call clippers and shavers. In those days, you had gold coins, and people would clip the edges of the coin off before they traded it to somebody, and they'd save those little clips, and then they would take it in and sell it. They were called shavers and clippers. A shaver would shave the coin, the gold off the coin, collect it, and then sell it separately. And counterfeiting was really a big thing.
How? How so?
Well, in those days, there weren't any Federal Reserve notes like we have today. There was a national bank, but there were also all kinds of local banks. And counterfeiters would just draw their own money. They'd just sit there and make a fancy bill and try and pass it off. In fact, I have a sample of one at home that a man got caught trying to pass and was arrested by the sheriff and was sent to the state penitentiary in Jeffersonville for counterfeiting. But these fellas in the Witt gang, they were into murder, robbery, theft of all sorts. You name it, they were involved with it. By about the 1830s, 38, 39 period, Witt goes to Indianapolis where there are bigger pickings, gets caught, and he's hung. The gang kind of breaks up, but one of the members of the gang stayed around for a longer period of time, and his name was William Joy. Just to give you an idea of the kind of people these were, William Joy lived in what we call the Narrows at LeGros. I think it's called 524, State Road 524. Yeah. It's that section that really winds around. That section has changed quite a bit. There used to be 3 or 4 log cabins located along the side of the road, and Joy lived in one of those cabins. The only source of income that Joy had that we know about was he would trap. He would trap beaver and whatever animals that he could find, fox, deer, or what have you, and he'd bring them into town and sell them here in Wabash, and then he'd go on a drunk. And he'd stay on a drunk for 2 or 3 days, then he'd go home and sober up, go back out, get some more animals, get the furs, bring them back in. It was just a vicious cycle. He was known as kind of a mean, ornery character. When he would come into town, he'd ride his horse into town. And in the westerns that you see where a guy would ride his horse into town and go into the saloon shooting guns, that's what William Joy would do. And nobody would bother him. They'd leave him alone. Just let him get drunk and let him stay to himself. But he'd go home and he'd be mean to his family. And he had a small infant child about 1854, 1854, somewhere in that range. He came home one day. His wife had had a child. It was a couple of months old and had the croup. And the baby wouldn't stay quiet. She couldn't get it quiet. She was outside making supper. In those days, you had an area outside when it was nice where you'd have a fireplace and a big pot. And you make stew or bean soup, something like that. And she was cooking the meal and had her daughter out there with her. And he came barreling out after one of his drunks, after sobering up somewhat, and the baby was screaming. He told her get this kid quiet. She tried, didn't work, kept crying. So he went in, got the baby, carried it outside, and the black pot that was sitting over the fireplace, he kicked it over to the side and then held the baby over the fire and roasted it. The neighbors heard the screaming, and they came running down to see what was going on. And by that time, he was back asleep. The flesh was already separating from the poor child, and of course it died. The family and the neighbors were all scared to death to say anything to the sheriff, but a year later, they did tell the sheriff. The sheriff arrested William Joy. He was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in prison at Jeffersonville, at the state penitentiary, where he died and was buried in either Clarksville or Jeffersonville. That was the kind of people that the Witt gang had as its members, and William was supposedly one of them. It was just a horrendous episode, but times were different back then. Yeah. And it was the Wild West in the early days, and people did come into town shooting their guns and chasing people down the street on their horses and getting into fights. It was a rowdy community, and in the early 1830s and early 40s, it was a wide open community. Everything went here.
That? Oh, okay.
That's what I mean by wide open. There was, the only law enforcement was the sheriff. There were no constables. There were no police. Just one sheriff. He may have deputies, but that was about it. Things change about 1849 when the city becomes a city, a town. It becomes incorporated, and then they have a constable or a town marshal who begins to take care of things like that, and it becomes a little bit more peaceful and not quite so rowdy.
And when people were arrested, like if the sheriff arrested someone, was there like the local jail that there's the old jail. People in Wabash refer to the old jail on, what is that, Main Street? Local Main Street. Would that have been where someone like William Joy would have been? Well, that was maybe too early for that. That was
built in 1878, so it was after that. But the jail before that was located, there's a vacant lot on Wabash Street at Wabash and South Main. You have City Hall, you have a vacant lot, Shears Building, and courthouse. That vacant lot is where the jail sat. And it was a wooden two-story affair made out of logs. And to keep men from sawing through it, they nailed huge nails into the wood. They would take you up to the second floor where they had a trap door, and then they would put you down into the bottom of the jail. If you had to go to the bathroom, you had a pot over the side that you used, and ever so often you'd lift that pot up and they'd empty it for you and give you a fresh pot to use. Food was handed down to you.
Through that same trap door.
Through that same trap door. About 1852, 3, somewhere in that area, they had an insane gentleman had been arrested and been placed in there, and he set fire. There was straw down there to keep it from smelling too bad and to sleep in. And he set it on fire, and the town turned out, formed a bucket brigade, but it was a lost cause. They got the man out, and there was snow on the ground. So since the bucket brigade wasn't doing much of stopping the fire, the people who came out, the men of the town, and there must have been 20 or 30 of them standing around watching, started a snowball fight. So they just let it burn down and had a snowball fight. They replaced it with another log cabin, which then later on we built the jail, what we call the old jail across from the courthouse in 1878. That was built, and of course it was a much better facility than the old jail had been. But yeah, the jail got well used, and
So that original wood jail that was on that corner prior to the insane man burning it down, that would have been a place where William Joy, someone like William Joy, would have been incarcerated until later then moved to the penitentiary.
right.
Okay.
Right. Now, in his case, he was shackled. They didn't just trust him to be down there with complete mobility. They shackled his arms and his feet so he would be limited because of his violent nature. As they were taking him to the train, after he had been found guilty of murder, he was put back in jail, and then he was taken to the train station, which was up on Sinclair Street, in between Sinclair and Hill. They took him up there to the train station. On the way up, he was shackled and had to hobble his way up there, and people standing in the crowd watching spit on him and hit him and abused him and violently, either with their fists or their feet or with words and spitting on him. It was a sight to behold. And they took him to Jeffersonville by train, going over to Peru, then down to Indianapolis, and then on down to Clarksville.
And that would have been right there, the last time you and I chatted, we talked about what it was like for slavery in the Underground Railroad. So this is about the same turn when slavery is abolished. And, that was in the later 1800s, too, isn't that right?
The 1860s. But
yeah. So this would have been, you said, the 1850s?
1850s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's where the jail was, right there. And normally they would have, maybe 4 to 6 people a month in jail, maybe at the same time, sometimes not have. They provided meals for them. It just depended upon the crime. Mm-hmm. In early Wabash, entertainment was much different than today. Taverns were a place to go for entertainment. There were social functions like dances that people would go to, but there was a lot of gambling. And one of the interesting forms of gambling was, at the time of William Joy, was something called, they would horse race, and they would do something called pull the gander. And pulling the gander could get you a night in jail, if not a week in jail, plus a fine. And pulling the gander was very simple. You took a 6-foot pole and you put it in the middle of Canal Street. Canal Street was rather flat, and that was the main street in the early days. And you would race your horse down to that pole. And on the top of the pole would be a goose, a gander, and you would nail its feet to the top of that pole. And you would race down there at full speed with your horse and try to grab the goose. And if you pulled the goose off of the pole, you got to keep the goose and you have supper. And also you would win whatever had been bet on that by whoever and what have you. It was not as simple as it might seem to be. And yes, it seems kind of cruel, but that was one of the early forms of entertainment, is to ride down through the middle of Canal Street and grab that goose off the top of a pole, if you could.
That was called
pulling the gander.
Pulling the gander.
And that was considered entertainment.
Now,
entertainment changes over time. By 1849, we have our first circus that we know about in Wabash. A circus actually did make it here. It came down by canal boat. Now, it wasn't a big affair. In fact, the circus was held at the Landing, which was on the southeast corner of Canal and South Wabash Street. And they set up their circus, their tent, right there in the middle of the street. And what they had was a clown or two, a few dog and pony acts, somebody sang a song. Some people did some jumping around, acrobatics of sorts. And that was the circus. And it was a big deal. People came from far and wide to see a circus like that. Eventually, by the 1850s, the circuses coming to town would have 50 or 60 acts, and they would pull in either by train by that time or by canal boat, and they would parade up and down Canal Street over to Huntington, then down Market Street, back to Canal Street, and they would have their circus located where the sewage plant is today, in that area off of Carroll Street. Back in there, people would go there to have fun and enjoy the circus. Of course, there were all kinds of entertainments. There were card sharks who would set up and they would play card games, poker, and so forth for money. The old shell game would be traditional. There'd be somebody doing that. There were some other illegal activities. Some of the actresses would perform acts on the side.
Yes.
Not
Not for the public.
Not for not for the general public.
Okay.
But people would turn out and go to these affairs and have a good time. Of course, there was also an element in Wabash that would turn out as well, and those were your pickpockets who would know how to take you for a ride and take your wallet if you were a little too loose with it. There was also a man who came up with an idea. He would stick a dollar bill in a box of soap, and he would sell you the box of soap saying there might be a dollar bill in there, and he would show you. He would open up one, and there was a dollar bill, but he had already planted the bill in there. The other boxes didn't have any soap in them at all. That was just one of the little tricks of the trade. Circuses were always big affairs, and even they later changed their location, and parades were always big. Eventually, the fairgrounds at the city park became the main place for circuses. And in the 1890s, they became even wilder. They had a Little Egypt exhibit, which made all the women in Wabash extremely mad. They had to close that down. Little Egypt became popular at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Little Egypt was a belly dancer.
Oh.
Okay. But if you saw her belly, I mean, that was really unusual. Generally, she wore skin-tight clothing and loose clothing. So if her skirt lifted, you thought you were looking at her leg, but you were actually looking at skin-colored tights. But in the one that came to Wabash, she had a floor made of mirrors and the sides of mirrors, and she didn't have petticoats on. And some people claimed it wasn't skin tights either. Anyway, that was enough to close down that act, and circuses became very unpopular, especially at the fairgrounds. And it was one of the reasons why we moved the fairgrounds to North Manchester. After the 1890s, they moved to North Manchester and had the fair there.
Because Wabash, the women in Wabash weren't having it, like they just were not.
Oh, they were upset. Their husbands were paying good money to go in there, and oh boy, no, you can't have that. But on Hill Street in particular, another form of entertainment, and maybe I'm getting off track here, tell me if I am, there were two houses of ill repute on Hill Street across from the train station, which had as many as 30 to 40 girls. And those were always full.
Of guests?
Of guests, yes. If you wanted a certain girl, they had a little bell. You would go in and you'd push the bell. 5 times for Sally, 6 times for Jan, so forth. That was their signal. And that stayed in effect until the 1930s when they moved, the mayor of Wabash made them move out of town. They moved to Logansport, and they set up a blue stocking district, red light district, on the west side of town on the Eel River. And that stayed in effect until the 1970s when the state legislature closed it down. But that was going from the 1870s on. But those weren't the only 2 houses.
Excuse me, Mr. Woodward. That red light district lasted till 1970?
In Logansport, the 1970s.
Okay.
And it was closed down by the state legislature.
That's a long run.
Well, it had a long run in Wabash, too.
Yeah, yeah.
In fact, there were people, traveling salesmen, who made it a point to spend the night in Wabash when they were going from Detroit or Toledo to St. Louis, would make a point to stay in Wabash just for that purpose.
That's a whole different kind of tourism.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
But that existed for a while. And, of course, there are more stories about that, and there were more locations as well. Even in LeGros had a red light district. And even the small town of Belden, which today has maybe 10 people, maybe 5 buildings, had a red light district. The women got so upset with it in the Belden area that one night they attacked. There were 2 ladies who'd set up in a log cabin, and they attacked one night and stoned the building and ran the ladies out of town. The women of the town did that.
During the gold, just about the gold rush, one thing I wanted to ask you, where would they have sold that? So even though it was very small time when people were here panning and looking for gold, 2 things. One, where would they sell? Like, where would you take that then to have that, give that monetary value?
I can't really answer your question, but I do know this. There were people in grocery stores who had little weights and measures, and they would weigh and measure it. What they did with it, I don't know. How they used it, I don't know. There weren't any assay offices like you see in the cowboy westerns.
Right. And the other would be, do you know if anyone who came to the area, you talked about neighboring communities after the man in LeGros found that large, 10-ounce nugget? Did anyone settle here and stay here for that purpose that you're aware of?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't.
Okay.
Some of the younger fellas may have liked it here, may have fallen in love with one of the local girls. That could have happened. I don't know.
Not that it's documented anywhere.
Right. Not that's been documented.
So it wasn't necessarily a population growth attractor. The gold rush of 1868 was very minor. But we did lose some of our population. Like you said, 3/4 of the 115 that went out west, you estimate 3/4 never returned. So, right. So actually it did impact our population just negatively for a time.
To a degree.
To a
yes,
degree,
to
yeah.
a degree, right.
Mr. Woodward, we have talked for another hour. But I love that our conversations just go and they wind, and things that you share, I know you weren't planning on sharing, they just come to mind, are so important and so relevant. So we are definitely going to hit our other topic of amusement parks, because I think
I was trying to get into that.
You were. We were close. We were really close. But we will set another time to record on this, because this, and truly, and I mean this, when you share, like, I had no idea about this at all. I never would have thought about a gold rush in Wabash County. Like, never would have thought about panning for gold at Charley Creek. I just never, ever worry about coming and taking us down a different road that we thought we were going to go down, because it's also really authentic and natural. You're just sharing. Mm-hmm. And that's my favorite part. I feel selfish because I enjoy it so much. And I mean that.
I'll share one other story with you.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't mind.
No, please. But I like to take
sometimes, so don't ever think
Okay.
I'm rude.
No. Back in the 1980s, I had a gentleman who heard me talk about that 1868 gold rush, and he asked if he could come up and visit. He was from Georgia, and I had been talking to him about Jesina Creek, which is outside of LaFountain, empties into the Mississinawa. I had found some flakes in there, and I was sharing that with him, and he wanted to go down and take a look at it. And as we were walking down a trail leading to where there was a sandbar that I thought somebody shot at us. They were down in there doing their own panning and shot a pistol up our way to scare us off.
Did it scare you off?
Then it did, but I've been back in there since.
Yeah.
But it scared him off. But he had heard about it. And in Georgia, they had a gold rush in Georgia in the, I want to say 1810s or 20s. And they're still finding some down there to this day. But he wanted to check it out here. And that actually happened. We walking down that trail, and pew, we had heard them before. They were lifting up rocks, large rocks, and throwing them because gold will sift down underneath those large rocks, sift into cracks, and it's easier to find that way. So you have to be careful.
Well, Mr. Woodward, that's been 1 hour.
Hi, I'm Ron Woodward, and these are the Woodward Chronicles. Thanks for listening.
The Woodward Chronicles podcast is made possible by the generous support of the Lisa Gilman Investment Fund, the Sandra Kunkel Trust, Mark and Amy Ford, Paperworks Industries, the Community Foundation of Wabash County, and Visit Wabash County, and is created by Destination Wabash County.